Hi, welcome to the Politics of U.S. Public Policy. Today we're going to be looking at one of the most fundamental transformations in the structure of American public policy and the role of government in citizens' lives, namely the rise of what's sometimes called the carceral state, and the ways in which the rise and the effects of this state have really deeply become intertwined with American politics. We'll start by looking at the causes of this development, and then we'll move to thinking more about its consequences and whether it might be reformed in the future. Now, I should say that on Wednesday, we're being joined by Professor Veshla Weaver at Johns Hopkins University, and Veshla, a good friend of mine, is really the leading scholar of this phenomenon, and I'm pleased to say that she'll be joining us and grateful that she gave me access to some of her slides to prepare this lecture. So what do I mean by the carceral state? Well, most obviously, I mean the massive system of imprisonment that has arisen at the state, local, and federal level in the United States since the 1970s. If you look at this figure, you see not only has the rise been dramatic, it has also been disproportionate. And a key theme of our discussion today will be the ways in which the carceral state is a huge, life-altering institution in the lives of African Americans in the United States, and particularly young Black men, and particularly young Black men without a college degree. The carceral state has also become an interesting political issue. This is an ad that ran during the Super Bowl.
I'm free to hug my family. I'm free to start over. This is the greatest day of my life. My heart is just bursting with gratitude. I want to thank President Donald John Trump. Woo! Thank you.
I'm Donald Trump, and I approve this message.
Now, you may be surprised to see that Donald Trump is touting his contribution to criminal justice reform. Trump gave clemency to Alice Johnson, but he also signed in December 2018 the First Step Act, which was the most significant criminal justice reform at the federal level in the last 25 years. The First Step Act was of a piece with other recent policy changes that have been supported by politicians in both parties at both the state and federal level. And it focused especially on the federal level, where the federal government has the greatest authority. And what the First Step Act really revealed is that criminal justice reform is a fascinating case that involves cross-cutting interest in institutions and policies in a way that really draws out the distinctive features of America's public policy-making institutions. So I said that the carceral state was at root a system of mass imprisonment, but it is rooted in a larger set of policies that we sometimes call criminal justice policies. And these policies, which encompass all levels of government, vary dramatically from place to place. They share in common their common motive of trying to control crime and impose penalties on those who violate laws. And as we'll see, they may have other motives as well, but they vary dramatically across jurisdictions, across agencies of government, and they vary dramatically in terms of the kinds of processes, judicial and otherwise, that are involved. But criminal justice policy is more than an illustration of key features of U.S. policy. It's also a really unusual area for a couple reasons. The first is that it is an area where we do not see a weak and fragmented state. We see lots of fragmentation, but fundamentally we see a highly intrusive and punitive and encompassing state intervening in the lives of mostly disadvantaged and mostly non-white citizens. This is an exceptional aspect of U.S. public policy, as we'll see. It's exceptional in the sense that it's different from some of the other faces of the U.S. state, which often look less aggressive, less ambitious, less encompassing. But it's also exceptional in the way that those other areas are exceptional. That is, it looks quite unusual in cross-national perspective. We also have a fundamental political puzzle. If you looked at that figure before, you'll see that the rise of incarceration is a relatively recent development. Since the 1970s, we've seen this enormous increase in those behind bars and other aspects of aggressive policing and punitive enforcement. And so the question naturally arises, why? Why this big shift? And why at a time when the US government was pulling back from its responsibilities in other areas? I also want to explore not just the question of why this happened, but also what effects it's had. And here I really want us to think not just about the social and economic effects, which are profound and profoundly tied up with the experience of race in the United States, but also the political effects. And then finally, we'll look at this rare bipartisan agreement that some change must happen and why it's yet, as I'll show, to achieve major changes in incarceration and other aspects of criminal justice. I said that the US was exceptional in cross-national perspective. Here's a very simple picture of just how unusual we are. Other democratic nations in the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, have orders of magnitude fewer prisoners behind bars. This disparity is not accidental. It reflects a shift away from a welfarist understanding of the state's role in the lives of poor and minority citizens to a much more punitive and social control role. You can see this perhaps most clearly in the juxtaposition of the share of the adult population receiving welfare benefits, which plummeted after the Welfare Reform Bill of 1995, and the share of the population that is within what's called the correctional population, that is behind bars or in processing. So why did the share of Americans behind bars rise so dramatically? Well, one reason, the one that often gets cited by those who have supported tough on crime policies, is that we did see a significant increase in violent crime. This figure sets rates to 100 for 1980. So you can compare these numbers by thinking about 100 as being the 1980 level, and then everything that's above 100 is higher than 1980 and everything below it is lower. And you can see that the level was even below 50 at the beginning of the series in 1960 for violent crime and property crime. By the 1990s, which was the peak in violent crime, you can see that the number was up to almost 150. So there was an underlying increase in crime, but the increase in incarceration is on a different scale. So something happened in policy that caused punishment to become much more punitive over this period. Now, it's important to note that once we turn to the question of punishment, we're really moving into the realm of politics because policy is at the center of it. And what this figure here shows from the work of Veshla Weaver is that there was a dramatic increase in attention to crime and the amount spent on criminal justice policies, starting, if you notice here, really in a concentrated period in the late 1960s. In other words, we're talking about a huge policy shift. Here's an equation that's helpful for thinking through the way in which policy influences the incarceration rate. Because incarceration isn't just a function of the level of crime, it's also a function of the chance that someone will be arrested, the chance that somebody who is arrested will be admitted to prison, and the time that they serve. And the shifts that we saw in policy occurred across all three of these additional causes of increased incarceration. There was more aggressive policing, more aggressive prosecution, and much, much longer sentences for those who were prosecuted and convicted. So let's think about the politics that lay behind this. Again, it was in the mid-1960s that we began to see a substantial shift in the ways in which politicians in both parties were talking about crime and punishment. The background, remember, for this is a fundamental shift in the American economic and political order brought about by the civil rights breakthroughs of the 1960s. But just as this shift was occurring, there was obviously great resistance in the South, particularly to the new racial order that was being forged. And this response, which Veshla Weaver called front lash, was in many ways a preemptive effort to try to reorient policy, to change the balance of power in the wake of this new legal regime created by the civil rights laws of the 1960s. It was led by Southern politicians. Most of them were within the Democratic Party at the time. Remember, the South was solidly Democratic in the 1950s and 60s. And there's very good evidence that some of the leading segregationist politicians, like Representative John Bell Williams, who also served as governor of Mississippi, that they tried to reframe the issue as one of social disorder and with a focus on law and order as a response. This was a political theme that was highly potent. It was picked up by Richard Nixon in his Southern strategy. It was propelled forward by the urban riots that occurred in the wake of the death of Martin Luther King. And it was also picked up by politicians of both parties as they responded to and then reinforced a shift in public opinion. That shift in public opinion looks a lot like the ones that we've seen in other areas where it was elites who often led the way, but they were not wholly conjuring up new sentiments. Rather, they were building on incipient backlash, often among white Americans, to their sense that the structure of society was changing too quickly, their status was being reduced, and that this was coming with a sense of social disorder and even the threat of violence. Now, the tough on crime rhetoric was mostly associated with conservative politicians, but very quickly, Democrats outside the South and African American leaders felt pressure to go along. In a lot of ways, right, for Democratic politicians, it was a politics of loss aversion. If crime was occurring on their watch and they could be blamed for it, they could very well lose office. And so the loss aversion was both the loss of property and life that was feared by citizens and the loss of office that Democratic politicians feared might result from those risks. And James Forman, in his powerful book, points out that there was a kind of politics of respectability among African American leaders that said, look, not only is crime a serious problem in our communities, but also we cannot be a legitimate voice in national debates if we don't seem like we're out in front in addressing this issue. All of this came together to create a kind of self-reinforcing feedback in favor of ever tougher criminal justice policies. Once the policies were in place and the institutions were set up, they were easier to use. It was a kind of one-way ratchet, right? It was hard to be the person who would say, look, we need to figure out how to deal with the underlying problems. We really shouldn't be locking up so many kids, especially young Black kids. It was hard to get out in front for the reasons I was just talking about. And so these policies were a one-way ratchet in favor of more punitive policies. And then, of course, this area has always been seen as a protected one. People do not want to shortchange the military and they do not want to shortchange the police. There's enormous respect for and support for so-called first responders. And police, of course, are kind of a quintessential blue-collar profession with a very strong positive image in most communities, at least most white communities. And that brings us to the last point, which is another self-reinforcing effect that we'll see in a moment, is that many of these policies actually weakened the communities that were most adversely affected. Weakened them not just economically and socially, but also politically. Here's an example that not that many people know about. The Census Bureau actually counts people who are behind bars as residents of the area where they're imprisoned, not residents of their home communities. And since census data are used both for representation and for funding, this was a kind of automatic way in which communities that were losing population because young men were going behind bars in other communities, these places that were losing population were losing economic benefits and they were losing political power, whereas the places that were dependent upon the growth of the criminal justice system were gaining both economically and politically. Fortunately, this has become more recognized and there's growing pushback from states and localities. And so many states and localities now are committed to counting residents as living in the home communities, even if they're behind bars, and not crediting those residents to the communities where they're imprisoned. Public opinion in this area did grow notably more punitive in the wake of the rise in crime and growing rhetoric of law and order that occurred in the 1960s and 70s. So this figure shows an increase in punitive sentiments from the early 1970s through the 1980s. But notably, you can see that this increase mostly occurs before 1980. But remember, it was actually after 1980 that we continued to see this really large increase in incarceration. The other thing this figure shows is there isn't a large difference between white and black Americans, at least on these measures. And this is suggestive, again, of the extent to which, at least during the period of rising incarceration, there was support within the black community for tougher policies, though presumably for very different reasons than you saw such support among white Americans. So I said that mass imprisonment has had enormous socioeconomic effects, and those effects have been disproportionate. So here's a figure that shows you the likelihood of imprisonment for young men from the cohort born in the 1940s to the cohort born in the 1970s. And you can see that the line goes up essentially for all groups, though it's very modest for white men at all education levels. But it's the dotted purple line that you should pay attention to. That's the one that shows African American men who did not finish high school. For those men, shockingly, the cohort born between 1975 and 79 had a risk of imprisonment by ages 30 to 34 of 70%. For young black men in general, and less educated young black men in particular, imprisonment and other kinds of contact with the criminal justice system have become routine life events, more common than many of those that we associate with transition from childhood into adulthood. When you look at young black men without a high school degree, the results are so shocking that they're almost hard to believe. 70% of young black men in this cohort will be arrested, and 57% will spend time behind bars. Now, you might be thinking, well, this is entirely because there's such high levels of crime in African American communities. Well, the answer is that there are higher levels of crime in many black communities, but the differences cannot begin to explain the differences in incarceration. This is most pronounced when we look at drug crimes. Remember, the incarceration rate is a function not just of the level of crime, but also the probability of arrest and prison admission and the amount of time served. And all of those things, as you can see here, differ dramatically between white and black Americans. The rates of drug use between white and black Americans are roughly the same, as you can see. They almost match the population averages. But then when you look at arrests, blacks are dramatically overrepresented. They're even more overrepresented when you look at convictions, and they're far more overrepresented still when you look at prison sentences. So the story is, once again, is not just about crime, it's also about policy and the politics behind that policy. Among the most profound socioeconomic effects are the effects of incarceration on earnings and wealth. This in many ways understates the effect of incarceration because rates of employment for those who are incarcerated, as you can see, are so much lower. That helps explain why the gap in earnings is so much greater than the gap in wages. The effect on wealth is even more profound. As you can see, those who have been incarcerated have experienced little or no increase in their wealth, whereas those who never experience incarceration over the course of their life, they experience rising wealth. And you can look here too, and just look at those who have been incarcerated, and you can see right away that their debt levels are dramatically high, right? As a percentage of annual earnings, Black men who've been incarcerated have debt that's equal to half of their median income. And as we'll see in a moment, one major reason for this is that the criminal justice system itself imposes enormous direct costs in the form of fees, bail costs, and other very high charges on those who are brought into the criminal justice system. The socioeconomic effects are not just effects on those who are behind bars. There are also effects on those who are close to or children of those behind bars. It's worth asking then whether or not what we have seen essentially is the creation of a new Jim Crow, a new racial caste system built not around legal restrictions on African Americans as a whole, but rather on a criminal justice system that has disproportionate effects on African Americans and their families. And in her provocative book, Michelle Alexander argues that this, in fact, was an intentional feature of the rise of mass incarceration in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. And that argument is perhaps most ably conveyed in visual form in this wonderful Netflix documentary. Just like Jim Crow, this new penal regime imposes significant limits on the economic and social flourishing and the civic capacities and opportunities of African Americans in the United States. This is a figure that shows you one of the most pernicious and pervasive of these constraints on civic life, namely Black disenfranchisement. So this is a share of the African American population in these states that is disenfranchised because of bars on ex-felons voting. It's worth noting that there's also, in many states, bars on ex-felons servings on juries, which means, of course, that in many cases it's hard to have juries that are representative of those who are charged with crimes. And it's not just policies that explicitly stop African Americans from participating. It's also the case that having encounters with the criminal justice system, as Lerman and Weaver have powerfully shown, reduces people's political and civic engagement and also increases their distrust of government and their sense that government doesn't work for them. In other words, encounters with the criminal justice system are teaching millions and millions of Americans, and disproportionately African American men, negative lessons about the political system. But as we saw at the outset, we have seen in recent years a growing momentum for criminal justice reform, one that, unlike almost any other issue in American politics today, cuts across the partisan divide. So it's worth asking whether or not the self-reinforcing feedback that we once saw is gradually being replaced by what might be called self-undermining policy feedback. After all, we've seen a dramatic drop in the incidence of crime, which takes away one of the powerful arguments made for tougher policies. It's been well known for some time that the relationship between incarceration and crime is very much a loose one. Incarceration can reduce crime by incapacitating people and also by deterring them from committing crimes in the first place. But it's worth noting that the period of people's lives in which they're most likely to engage in criminal activity is pretty short. Yet we are putting people behind bars often for decades and indeed sometimes for their whole lives. Moreover, we know that if people are coming out of jails and prisons, they may well be more likely to commit crimes as a result of the experience of being behind bars. It's also the case, as Steve Tellis and David Dagan write in their book Prison Break and in this piece in National Affairs, that as liberals and Democrats move to be tougher on crime, the issue ceased to be as potent one for dividing the two parties. For conservatives, the appeal of the issue declined as the degree to which both Democrats and Republicans were converging on a tough on crime framing of the issue. And then there's the simple fact that imprisoning people is expensive. The budget crisis that occurred in the wake of the Great Recession due to the financial crisis really devastated state and local finances. Were it not for the federal spending that ramped up during this period, states would have been much more devastated than they were, but nonetheless, they were very heavily impacted. And this really was a crystallizing moment for many fiscal conservatives who began to see spending on correctional institutions as a major cause of state budget imbalances and no longer as useful for pursuing policy aims that they wanted. So both left and right came to this issue for different reasons. On the left, it was an issue of social and economic justice. The groups that mobilized on this side put heavy emphasis on the cost, and particularly the disproportionate cost that were being borne by disadvantaged communities. On the right as well, this was an issue of justice too, though it was often one that was more tied up with Christian faith. For example, Charles Colson, who was one of the people convicted during the Watergate investigations, became a major leader on the right, arguing for a more Christian and forgiving approach to crime. You can see down here on the right that one of the things that Colson's Prison Ministries does is give Bibles to those behind bars. Charles and David Koch, the Koch brothers, though you may know that David Koch passed away recently, the Koch brothers actually spent a lot of money on criminal justice reform efforts. And I would be remiss not to mention that there has been a new bipartisan push for decarceration due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The risks that these prisoners in close proximity face is really remarkably high. But so far, the efforts to try to move prisoners who are older, who are sicker, and who pose less risk to society, those efforts have been halting and incomplete. And we only have a matter of days, perhaps, before we see dramatic increases in COVID-19 cases and deaths behind bars. What are some of the policies that are being pursued in this bipartisan push? So first, there are efforts to decarcerate. This involves both trying to divert people into alternatives to imprisonment before they become part of the prison population, and to move people out of prison. Now, it's notable that most of these efforts have not been retroactive, but rather forward-looking, to try to provide greater discretion to judges or to reduce the length of sentences by eliminating mandatory minimums or 3 strikes you're out laws. There have been more substantial efforts with regard to juveniles. And here the real issue is juveniles do not have to go into the adult prison system in many cases. That's a decision that's left up to state policy and local policy. And there's a lot of evidence that juveniles are distinctively vulnerable in the adult system. The negative socioeconomic effects of incarceration could be reduced by trying to encourage employers not to pay attention to past criminal records. Some localities have tried to ban the box, that is, to ban the asking of people about past criminal records. But there are some real limits. So far, the focus has been on quote-unquote nonviolent offenses, and therefore a very large share of people are not actually receiving the benefits of these policy changes because they're considered violent offenders. And there has really been limited efforts to try to do more to invest in the kinds of alternatives to incarceration that we know are likely to produce better long-term social outcomes for those who might end up behind bars and their families and communities. So we can see some of the effects here. Since the late 2000s, the number of people behind bars has stabilized, and in the case of drug convictions has actually declined. But you can see here that this is not a dramatic reversal so far. It's a leveling off and a slight reversal with regard to drug convictions. So why have the effects so far been limited? Well, once again, I want to remind you of our basic equation. The incarceration rate results from the interaction of several factors. And it's important to recognize that there is enormous buildup pressure in the system because many of the people behind bars are set to stay behind bars for much of their life unless their sentences are changed. This buildup pressure is reinforced by the fact that this is really not a federal policy issue. So most of the action in this policy area is occurring at the states and localities. Even if the federal government is moving to change policy, it is not actually changing what's happening on the ground in many places. This is the domain of street-level bureaucracy. So it could be both that you don't see policy changes at the state and local level, and that you might not see the street-level bureaucrats in this area, namely the police and prosecutors, changing their behavior. So here you go. If you look at this, you can see a clear decline in the total prison population after the mid-2000s. And you can see at the state level that most states have seen a decline, though, interestingly, a few states have seen an increase. But now let's look at the long-term trajectory. If we saw declines that continued at the current rate, even by 2091, that is 71 years from today, we would still not see the prison population down to the level it was before the huge spike in incarceration. And then finally, I want to mention that the response has been limited to some extent by the fact that those most adversely affected by criminal justice policies are also demobilized by those policies. I think the most dramatic event that has started to change that was the killing of Michael Brown and the subsequent protests in Ferguson, Missouri. Ferguson is distinctive for two reasons. One, it's one of the first times in which we've seen the federal government step in recent years to discipline and call attention to the poor practices of a locality that relied heavily on criminal justice activities to finance its government. And remember, this was also the place where the Black Lives Matter movement first gained attention. Black Lives Matter dates back to 2013, but it's really risen in prominence and impact in the last 5 to 7 years. And that impact has not all been reinforcing. There has been backlash against it. But Black Lives Matter is a remarkable social movement. It is one that actually does have actual centers of organization and leaders, but it is very decentralized and social media oriented. And a question I guess we should ask is whether or not it might be a movement like the Tea Party that is institutionalized and affects the Democratic Party for the long term. There are signs that that's happening, or one more like Occupy Wall Street, which was a sort of flash movement in 2011 that brought inequality to the fore, but then faded in its own importance and organizational relevance. And we can't neglect the reality that we live at a time of significant white backlash. And we've seen that white backlash play out with regard to criminal justice policies already. So the phrase "Blue Lives Matter" was prominent during Trump's 2016 campaign, and he relied heavily on the support of police unions during it, suggesting that there is a significant constituency of those within the criminal justice system who believe that these changes have already gone too far. A case study is what's happened in Florida. In 2018, by a margin of nearly 2-1, Floridians approved an amendment that was designed to restore the voting rights of those who had had their voting rights taken away because they'd previously been convicted of a felony, a policy that had been in place since just after the Civil War. And it looked as if in the 2020 election, there would be a historically larger African-American electorate because of this change in policy. And yet, in 2019, the Republican-controlled House and Senate essentially put into place a policy that made this new 2018 amendment approved by the voters all but null and void. The policy basically said that you had to pay full restitution. And that restitution, which was mentioned in the amendment, had to include the court costs, fines, and fees that were involved with ex-felons' incarceration and prosecution. Now, that might seem like a minor thing, but it's not. Because as Ferguson showed us, the amount that is extracted from these communities and from the incarcerated themselves, both before and during their imprisonment, those amounts are staggering. And it means that for many of those who might otherwise have their voting rights restored, the amendment passed overwhelmingly by citizens of Florida is virtually meaningless. So we face a continuing challenge. Despite the increased support for criminal justice reform, the system is so entrenched and so large that it will take enormous effort over time to reverse and perhaps undo the rise of America's carceral state. This has to take place not so much in the federal legal context, but at the level of state prisons and local jails. Lest we despair, we should recognize that this is also an opportunity not only to right historic wrongs, but to rebalance race relations in the United States. The challenges are great, the opportunity is great, and hopefully when we discuss this with Veshla Weaver on Wednesday, we can think more about the possibilities that lie before us.